As of this week, Canada's chief trade negotiator walked into a room in Ottawa and told a chamber full of Canadian business leaders something that should have made international headlines but didn't. She said, "July 1st is a checkpoint, not a cliff." And the way she said it, measured, precise, almost too calm, told everyone in that room exactly how close to the edge Canada actually is. Because here is what that language means when you strip the diplomatic veneer off it. It means Canada and the United States have not agreed on the terms of the most important trade deal in North American history. It means 70 days from now, the review begins without resolution in sight. And it means the fight over a $20 billion dairy market, one that has been brewing for 3 decades, is about to become the pressure point for everything else Canada sells to the United States, which is roughly $550 billion worth of goods every single year. This is the moment people will look back on when they try to explain how the North American economic order changed. Not a war, not a crash, a dairy dispute, and a law that made the solution illegal. Understand what is at stake for you specifically, because this story has a way of staying abstract until it doesn't. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement governs the movement of goods that touch nearly every part of your daily life. Your groceries, your car, the price of steel in the building you work in, the energy costs baked into every product manufactured in this country. When that agreement is in a state of annual renegotiation, when companies cannot plan beyond 12 months because the rules of cross-border trade might change at any review, the cost of uncertainty doesn't stay on a spreadsheet. It moves into the price tag on the shelf in front of you. Here is the foundation for everything that follows. We know the legal architecture of this dispute because it is documented, public, and precise. Bill C-202, which received royal assent in Canada in June 2025, legally prohibits any Canadian government from increasing tariff rate quotas or reducing tariffs on dairy, poultry, and eggs in any future trade negotiation. This is not a policy preference. It is statute. On the American side, USTR Jamieson Greer testified before Congress and stated explicitly that a 16-year extension of CUSMA is contingent on fixing what he called specific and structural issues, and that dairy market access is at the top of that list. Simultaneously, in July 2025, the United States International Trade Commission opened a formal probe into Canadian dairy exports, targeting alleged dumping of surplus skim milk powder and whey protein into U.S. markets, with findings expected in March 2026, 3 months before the review deadline. We have the timeline, we have the legislation, we have the congressional testimony. This is not speculation. This is the documented structure of an impasse. Picture the moment it crystallized. It is December 2025. Jamieson Greer is seated at a congressional table in Washington. The room is full. He is calm. He speaks the way someone speaks when they have already decided. He tells the committee that the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement has delivered value, but that structural shortcomings remain. He names dairy explicitly. He says the review is not a formality. He says the 16-year extension is not a given. The cameras run. The transcript is filed. And in Ottawa, in the offices of the Trade Ministry, someone reads that statement and understands immediately that the opening position has just been made public record. At the same moment, Mark Carney is preparing his own answer. And his answer is not a counteroffer. It is a citation. He points to the law. He says supply management is not on the table. He says it not with defiance, but with the tone of someone reading the terms of a contract. There is no ambiguity, no diplomatic cushion. And what that moment reveals, the psychological core of this confrontation, is that Carney is not negotiating, he is informing. He has converted a political choice into a legal inevitability, and in doing so, he has removed from the table the very thing Washington is demanding. The law does not just protect dairy farmers, it protects Carney from being asked to sacrifice them. Now the receipts. Because the facts of this dispute are more damaging than the rhetoric, and the rhetoric is already severe. The 3.6% that does nothing. When Trump's first administration negotiated CUSMA, American dairy groups called the outcome a historic win. For the first time, they had guaranteed tariff-free access to 3.6% of the Canadian dairy market. It was celebrated as the crack in the wall. Except the wall did not crack. American dairy exports to Canada barely shifted. The reason is structural. Canada allocated those tariff rate quotas almost entirely to domestic Canadian processors, companies that already buy Canadian milk, already run on domestic supply, and have zero financial incentive to import American product. The access exists in the text of the agreement. In practice, it is a door that opens into a room with no windows. American industry groups began calling this quota manipulation, not a violation of the agreement, but an exploitation of its architecture. Compliance with the letter while strangling the intent. That is the grievance that has been building for 5 years and is now the explicit centerpiece of Washington's case entering July. The ITC probe and its engineered timing. In July 2025, the U.S. International Trade Commission launched a formal investigation into Canadian dairy protein exports. The allegation: Canadian producers were blending and relabeling surplus non-fat solids, skim milk powder, whey protein, to evade the export caps written into CUSMA.
Ottawa's response was measured. Canada represents less than 1% of global dairy protein exports. The volumes are minimal. The domestic market is the priority. All of that is accurate. None of it is the point. Because the probe was timed to deliver its findings in March 2026, 3 months before the CUSMA review begins. That timing is not accidental. A formal ITC ruling in the U.S.'s favor would give Washington legal cover to impose punitive duties on Canadian dairy exports and to use those duties as leverage across every other negotiating file: automotive, steel, energy, critical minerals. The dairy probe is the legal instrument that makes dairy the master key. A finding in Canada's favor diffuses it. A finding against Canada hands Washington a crowbar. The household arithmetic that exposes the real political cost.
Supply management is often presented in Canadian public debate as a rural lifeline, a system that protects small dairy farms from the brutality of global commodity markets. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The same system that stabilizes farm income also inflates consumer prices. Estimates from independent economists place the annual household cost of supply management at between $300 and $600 per family on the low end. That is not a rounding error. That is a meaningful fraction of a grocery budget, particularly for lower-income households who spend a higher share of their income on food and absorb the price premium disproportionately. Recent polling shows 29% of Canadians now favor eliminating supply management entirely. That number was not where it is 5 years ago. Urban discontent is growing. And Carney knows that any concession to the United States, no matter how technically minor, will be weaponized domestically. while any defense of supply management will cost him credibility with voters who are already asking why they pay more for milk than anyone else in the G7. The annual review trap. This is the piece of the story that almost no outlet is reporting with the clarity it deserves. July 1st is not a deadline in the legal sense. Trade lawyers confirmed it this week. If Canada and the United States do not confirm a 16-year CUSMA extension, the agreement does not expire. What happens instead is the review cadence changes. Instead of meeting every 6 years, the three parties convene annually. The agreement remains in force until 2036. But annual reviews mean annual pressure, annual threats, annual leverage. And what Greer has signaled in congressional testimony and in public statements is that the U.S. prefers this structure, a 10-year framework of annual reviews rather than a fixed 16-year extension, which means the United States gets to come back every 12 months with a new list of demands. Dairy this year, digital trade next year, automotive rules the year after. Canada would spend a decade defending its economic sovereignty in 12-month cycles. That is not a trade agreement. That is a managed subordination. Here is what every other outlet is missing, and it is not a small thing. The mainstream coverage of this dispute frames it as a bilateral standoff. Trump versus Carney, American dairy farmers versus Canadian supply management. But the real contest is not between two governments. It is between two models of how trade agreements function. The United States is proposing, through its preference for annual reviews, through its conditioning of CUSMA extension on specific outcomes, that trade agreements should be living documents, perpetually negotiable, subject to the political priorities of whoever holds power in Washington at any given time. Canada is defending the opposite model, that agreements are binding, that commitments are durable, and that legal structures, like Bill C-202, represent sovereign decisions that external pressure cannot override. Let me translate the stakes of that disagreement into plain English. If the U.S. model wins, then no agreement Canada signs is ever truly settled. Every sector, dairy today, digital tomorrow, energy the year after, remains perpetually on the table. Canadian businesses cannot plan. Canadian government cannot commit. Canadian sovereignty becomes contingent. That is the civilizational consequence buried underneath the milk tariff argument. And it is the one that trade ministers are actually losing sleep over. Now steelman the American position, because it is stronger than Carney's framing of it suggests. The grievance about quota manipulation is real. A commitment to 3.6% market access that channels that access to the one group with no incentive to use it is not a good faith implementation of an agreement. The ITC allegations about non-fat solid dumping, whether ultimately upheld or not, reflect genuine frustration from a U.S. dairy sector that produces at scale and finds itself structurally excluded from a wealthy neighboring market that sits 90 minutes from the border. And the argument that supply management costs Canadian consumers hundreds of dollars per year is not propaganda. It is an economic reality that urban Canadians are increasingly aware of and increasingly resentful toward. The American position is not manufactured. The market access they were promised is not being delivered in any meaningful sense. That is a legitimate complaint about the implementation of a signed agreement. But here is where the legitimate complaint meets an immovable structural reality. The concession the United States is demanding, open the dairy market, requires Canada to repeal a law, blow up a political coalition, and absorb a regional backlash in Quebec and rural Ontario that could topple a government. That is not a negotiating ask. It is a demand to commit political suicide. And here is the deeper problem. Even if Carney wanted to find a technical workaround, redirecting quota access toward retailers rather than processors, as American dairy groups have explicitly suggested, that move would be framed by the Bloc Québécois and the dairy lobby as the first brick removed from the wall. In politics, perception of betrayal is as dangerous as betrayal itself. The technical fix and the fatal concession look identical to the 11,820 dairy farm families watching from the eastern townships. Understand the two men in this story. Donald Trump's approach to trade is consistent across every context. Apply maximum visible pressure. Make the cost of non-compliance explicit. Wait for the other side to calculate that the pain of resistance exceeds the pain of concession. Then extract a win that can be announced to your base. That playbook has worked. It worked in the first CUSMA negotiation. It worked with steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018. What the playbook requires is an opponent who can concede. And what Bill C-202 did, deliberately, precisely, is ensure that Canada cannot. You cannot pressure someone into giving you something they have legally made impossible to give. That is not stubbornness. That is structural immunity. Notice what Trump has not done. He has not threatened unilateral CUSMA withdrawal. The reason is that the American industrial base, auto, steel, energy, manufacturing, would revolt before the threat was credible. The $550 billion in annual Canadian exports to the U.S. have a mirror image. Hundreds of billions in American goods flowing north, and supply chains so integrated that disentanglement would cost American factories more than Canadian farms. Mark Carney, for his part, is running a doctrine of sovereign legalism. He is not arguing that supply management is economically optimal. He is not even arguing that the American grievances are without merit. He is arguing that Canada has made a legal decision, that legal decisions are sovereign, and that external economic pressure does not override domestic law. That doctrine is more powerful than it looks because it removes the negotiating dynamic entirely. You cannot threaten someone into changing a law. You can only threaten them into changing a law if they want to survive the threat more than they want to keep the law. And Canada has spent the past year building the economic diversification that makes the threat survivable. The UAE investment, the India FTA negotiations, the China canola access deal, which means the leverage Washington is applying is operating on a country that has deliberately reduced its dependence on the partner applying it. Three voices have decoded this moment with unusual clarity. William Pellerin, a Canadian trade lawyer, has identified a theoretical gray area in Bill C-202. The law does not explicitly mention quota allocation mechanics, which might allow a technical redistribution of access without technically triggering the statute. A hairline crack. But he frames it as theoretically possible and politically suicidal, because even if it is legally permissible, the perception of movement would detonate the dairy lobby's political response. Janice Charette, Canada's chief trade negotiator, said yesterday in Ottawa that July 1st is a checkpoint, not a cliff, which is technically true and strategically essential to say, because it deprives Washington of the artificial deadline it has been using as a pressure mechanism. And an economist at McGill framed the core dilemma in terms that are genuinely clarifying. Canada is not choosing between dairy and the rest of its economy. It is choosing between the political cost of concession and the economic cost of perpetual uncertainty. Both costs are real. Neither is free. And when people on opposite sides of this issue, trade lawyers in Washington and trade lawyers in Ottawa, agree that annual reviews are more dangerous than a July cliff, you pay attention. Here is what the next 70 days mean at each level of consequence. For the average household, the risk is not a sudden spike. It is the slow creep of uncertainty pricing. If CUSMA enters annual review mode, businesses that manufacture across the border begin building contingency margins into their costs. Those margins move downstream, into your grocery cart, into your car loan, into the energy bill. The impact is not dramatic. It is corrosive. $30 here, $50 there. The kind of inflation that does not have a news cycle, but grinds against household budgets for years. For Canada's political map, the dairy dispute is a coalition stress test. Carney's Liberal government holds Quebec, barely, because it has credibly committed to supply management's inviolability. The moment that credibility is questioned, the Bloc Québécois has its campaign. And the moment Quebec becomes contested again, the federal political arithmetic changes fundamentally. The dairy file is not just agricultural policy. It is the load-bearing wall of the government's regional coalition. For the global trading system, what is being tested here is whether mid-sized democracies can maintain binding agreements in an era when the largest economy in the world has decided that agreements are conditional. If Canada holds and the annual review structure is defeated, if a 16-year extension is confirmed on terms that do not require supply management concessions, it establishes a precedent that formal agreements can be defended by structural legal constraints, even against overwhelming pressure. If Canada breaks, or if the annual review trap closes, the opposite precedent is set. And every trade negotiator in every country watching this unfolds understands which precedent they are about to inherit. But here is what this story is really about. It is not about dairy. It is not about milk prices or quota allocation or skim milk powder dumping. It is about whether a country can govern itself when its largest partner has decided that governance is a negotiation. Canada's answer, encoded in law, backed by political will, reinforced by deliberate economic diversification, is yes. The question is whether that answer is durable across a decade of annual pressure designed to wear it down. There is a farmer in Quebec this morning who has no idea that his cows are at the center of a civilizational argument about economic sovereignty. He did not ask to be the detonator for a $550 billion trade confrontation. He is operating inside a system that was promised to him as permanent. Bill C-202 was passed in his name. Carney's press conferences are delivered in his defense. And the most uncomfortable truth of this entire story is that the system built to protect him is also the system that costs his urban compatriots $600 a year on groceries, and that the resolution of this dispute will be decided not by either of them, but by lawyers, negotiators, and politicians in rooms they will never enter. His silence is the loudest sound in this story. Not ignorance, not indifference. The silence of someone who was told the decision was final and is waiting to find out whether that was true. 3 dates. June 1st, Greer reports to Congress. That report is the first hard signal, extension offered or annual review mode triggered. Watch the language. The adjectives matter. July 1st, formal review begins. The path set at that table holds for a decade. and watch for the ITC dairy ruling in the window between now and June. A ruling in Washington's favor hands the U.S. its legal crowbar. A ruling in Canada's favor diffuses the most acute pressure point. Both outcomes change the trajectory. The next 72 hours matter more than the next 72 news cycles, because what gets filed, said, or decided in that window will either hold this story in place or blow it wide open. If this breakdown helped you see past the headline, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel exists to decode what the institutions are actually doing, not what they say they're doing, because in trade policy, those two things are rarely the same. The next move comes fast. You need to be here when it lands. One question for the comments: does Canada's legal wall hold through a decade of annual reviews? Or does sustained American pressure eventually find the crack? Tell me where you stand.